Chris, so where's your accent from, dude? Because I can hear quite a bit of English twang. But did you grow up in France, or?
I did. I grew up in France. I've never lived in Britain. But my parents moved to near Switzerland when I was a kid. So yeah, I've spent 30 years in France. But I grew up with, when you live near Switzerland, speaking two languages is lower than the average. Most people speak German, Italian, French, everything. And I grew up with the BBC and all that stuff, which is why my accent is
I see.
Quite neutral.
Because if I
sound like a true British boy.
Yeah, if I had eyes closed, right, I would have been like definitely from like Surrey or something like that.
Oh no, I don't know. I don't have an opinion. I don't know what's good or what's bad, but whatever. As long as I pass for British, that'll do me fine.
Absolutely. Were you so why Rennes? Why did you set up in Rennes and not any of the French cities?
Well, my parents moved to Brittany at one point, and Rennes is quite a big centre of R&D, telecommunication and stuff like that. A lot of old tech, stuff like Minitel, which you probably don't know. There used to be kind of these computer terminals which were spread around France, and it started here. There's quite a few communications companies, there's quite a few research centres. There's a lot of cybersecurity set up here in the past few years. So Rennes a pretty cool place to set up. And it's not too big. You can walk across it. There's probably 200,000 or 300,000 people here, and quite a few students too. So it's a great place to live, and there's a lot of stuff to do here.
And geographically, where is Rennes in France? Is it?
It's towards the west. If you got like the westernmost point of France and Paris, we're pretty much in the middle of that.
Right. Okay. Cool.
And what's France like in terms of like startup scene? I haven't really heard much. Many French companies coming out of France. Is it up and coming? Is there a history there of startups, or what's the situation?
Well, there's always been great technology in France. There's some good engineers over here. There's I was talking about Minitel earlier on. There's stuff like high-speed rail, high-speed internet. We're pretty good at that, and cybersecurity too. What's changed in the past, maybe 10 to 20 years, is they've realised that a lot of their engineers go abroad. A lot of their engineers end up in, Britain or the US or Korea, as far as fiber is concerned. That was an interesting one. And so in the last few years, there's been a push to start new companies. And the president actually said we really need the French startup scene to take off. So we've got some big stuff. We've got Station F, which is, they say, the biggest startup incubator in the world, which is an old train station which they reconverted into lots of open spaces and some quite cool places to work. And lots of spaces like that have been starting up left and right. There's a few places like that in France around the country, and there's some well-known companies that have come out of France, not necessarily well-known outside of France. I don't know if you've heard of BlaBlaCar or back market companies like that. Generally, I think the reason why we don't necessarily pick out French companies is that we internationalize quite quickly. You can't sell a product which is French, and so quite quickly you communicate in English and you set yourself up as an international company.
Right, and it sounds, just from what you said, that it seems to be quite heavy in more R&D, deep tech, infrastructure type companies rather than pure software. Correct me if I'm wrong.
There is a lot of that, and I'm biased because I come from research, so I've seen a lot of that. But we've got quite a few. No, there's quite a lot of. There's quite a few startups. Yeah, I think if you went through the list, you'd actually be quite surprised. It's. I'd say we're catching up in terms of investment and getting money into companies to let them scale. But it is growing, and I think we've put quite a few companies on the map now.
When you say they internationalize quickly, is that like they get to a point where they've proven their product market fit in France, and then they target the international market very quickly? And if that's so, what countries do you think they go to first? Because I imagine Would it first be the UK or go straight to America? Because an anecdotal story that we had from a previous guest was a lot of Israeli startups, because Israel is such a small market. But I think in 2022 or it might be 2021, that 41 unicorns, which is just insane for such a, per capita unicorn is probably the highest in the world.
Yeah.
And one of the guys that came on our podcast was an investor, and he was basically telling us that they have to do that because they don't have an option to trade locally because they don't have the best trade relations with the surrounding countries. So from the very inception, they're like, okay, we prove our product here in Israel, and then we go global, usually starting in the States. So just wondering, is there a parallel there with France? Obviously, I know not in terms of the geopolitical context, but rather in what countries would they go to internationalize quickly?
Well, I think Israel has quite a tight relationship with the US, so there's good means for them to move to the US quickly. What I meant by internationalize is French being... English is still the international language, and so companies will rapidly start communicating in English, and they'll adopt the model which the US has popularized, and so you won't identify a company as being French if you look on their website, or that's changing a tiny bit. You see companies really pushing the fact that they're developed in France and they work in France, but still language-wise, it's always English. And as far as markets, well, that kind of depends on your verticals. It depends on what industry you're looking at. If you're working with transport, then France is pretty cool, I would say. Any deep tech nuclear stuff, there's quite a few ways to work there. But even though France is probably the fourth or fifth economy in the world, I'd say it's probably easier to sell in Scandinavian countries, in the UK, in the US, though you do need the funds. But
why is that? Is that a cultural thing? What is the reason why it's so hard to sell internally in France?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, it depends on the product you're selling, and it depends on the problem that you're solving. I'd say that culturally, France is a bit different. You're talking to... we're a bit more risk averse in France, I'd say. So people are willing to bet on new technologies a bit more in countries where you want to be competitive and you want to stick out and you want to really be a leader and get an advantage compared to your competition. Whereas in France, there's a lot more institutionalized stuff. There's a lot more, the government has a bigger position in terms of pushing stuff. People don't necessarily like taking risks. I think the engineering culture also pushes the idea that maybe we can build this ourselves rather than buy a new solution. So that kind of not invented here is quite strong here.
Where do you think that inherent conservatism comes from? Because I feel that's prevalent in the UK as well. I've definitely experienced that since moving to London.
I think it's tricky to say. I wouldn't necessarily. I don't know. Probably something to do with when you have. If you're talking to the US, for example, there's this thing about the American dream and people pushing stuff and people taking risks, and I haven't tested it fully, but there's this idea that if you fail in the US, you must have learned something, whereas if you failed in France, then you can't try again. Yeah, that's changing now, but it really used to be. I think 20 years ago, if you sunk a company, then you couldn't try a second time.
I agree.
Investors wouldn't even talk to you.
So it was like a black mark against you, as opposed to somewhere in the US where it's like, all right, this guy's done it before. He's definitely learned from something. Yeah. There are even VC funds in the US that will only invest in, second, third time founders. That's a really interesting insight.
Yeah, you wouldn't make the same mistakes twice, and you'd come out of that with a better network. You come out of that with knowing exactly where to go, and you probably go faster too.
It's like they're much more forgiving there, and they're much more. I read this in a book by psychology about 12 years ago. I think in the UK, it's like let's say once you've been to jail, a large population of a large percentage of population will see you as a criminal. It's like, that's it. That is now your identity. You've done that. That's what you become. It's like once you start a business and you failed, you are now a failure.
Yeah.
There's no coming back from it. Whereas in the US, it's like, it's just so different, right? People are always open to the susceptibility of change. You can always change. Oh, you failed once. Oh, get up and try again. That you're more of an individual for standing up after a failure and trying again than standing up the first time and failing the first time, which I think is very interesting.
I think it's rooted in history as well, I think, because, the people that came from Europe to the Americas were, by their very nature, disruptors, willing to take risks, willing to go out on a limb, to cross a huge ocean with uncertainty of what the rest of their life would look like, right?
Yeah.
And having to build cities from nothing and this and that. So I think it's actually great. I was literally speaking about this topic yesterday with someone.
Yeah.
And they came to the UK briefly to study. And she said, I was taken aback by, everyone's very intelligent, everyone's very switched on, but it's all about risk aversion. How can I minimize my risk? And she made the argument that it was rooted in history as well. And it comes from, like, I don't know if you have any insight into this, Christopher, or you agree with it, but kind of the history of our monarchy and the history of, rules and even fiefdoms and stuff like this, and the feudal system going back a long time, where we in the UK are very much used to regimented structure and some kind of hierarchy, which means people are less willing to put a foot out of place. And that's very much ingrained in us over generation after generation. Of course, one person's opinion, and you may not agree with that, but that's just a contrast with the US, where everyone kind of came over on equal footing. And in the kind of constitution, it was very much like, rights for everyone, equal footing where possible. Of course, you have, a whole another 200 years of history subsequent to that, where there were all kind of racial issues and stuff like that. But the whole mentality of coming in and trying to give everyone a fresh start, that just isn't prevalent in Europe, given our history.
Yeah, I think it depends on which country you're talking to. I'd say maybe countries like Estonia, which granted are a bit smaller, the attitude's a bit different. But if you're building on a culture which is a couple of thousand years old, or at least has mythology which says it's a couple of thousand years old, it's different, because you arrive in the country and you're supposed to fit in. Whereas in the States, the country's a bit more recent, and the ideals there's a lot. They're supposed to be based on diversity, new ideas, and it's built upon the idea, not necessarily who the people were to start with. And so I think it's much easier to have new ideas and to push new ideas, and it's not based on a culture which, if you don't follow that, then you stick out.
Yeah. By definition, everyone there is an outsider, right? So it's kind of like we all came from somewhere else, so we're all trying to build something here and rise together.
Oh yeah. It's going to be interesting, because in 2012 I was a bit worried about the London Olympics, because I thought it could be really cheesy. I think they succeeded, and now we've got the opportunity to see what France is going to do in 2024, and maybe it'll be cheesy. I don't know. Are they going to be talking a lot about the revolution? Are they going to be really talking about stuff which isn't current? Whereas I was in Montreal the other day, and the message about what Montreal is much different. It's about lots of different people coming to build something together, and I think that's much more enthusiastic when you're trying to build something new, or you're trying to explore new ideas.
Interest. So cheesy to you in this context would be like kind of unnecessarily delving into historical past that's not relevant in the modern world.
Yeah, if you're trying to push things forward and you're trying to innovate and you're trying to solve problems, you don't want the message to be, we used to have castles and kings and here's our proud mythology. And because the idea then is you have to follow that to be able to fit in and to be able to talk to people. It makes things much more difficult, I think.
So how would you say, in your opinion, that France could carve a new identity for itself in this sort of new and rapidly changing world?
Well, there's a lot of emulation. I think we might be on the right path. There's a lot of new investors, but I think they need to be less risk averse and we used to have quite an identity as pushing new ideas, as being leaders in lots of different domains, and I think we need to kind of vindicate that and keep on pushing in that direction. We've got a lot of good labs, we've got a lot of good R&D, and I think we're still pretty good at marketing, but I think we need to put a lot more of that technology on the table and not necessarily rush to go to the United States and think, well, we can actually do this in France. We can say that we're French and we can develop new technologies. And I think that applies to the UK, and it applies to Italy and Spain and all the different countries and Germany. And though we might be quite uniform in our cultures, there's a lot of stuff that we can actually do, and we can be proud of what we're doing.
Oh, absolutely. I think as an entrepreneur, for me, the most frustrating thing is what we were just discussing there, is that, because as you correctly said, you're not battling an infrastructural problem. Because if you were starting a company, somewhere in India 10 years ago, or somewhere in the African continent, it might be an infrastructural issue that you come across where there's a lack of funding here, or there's a lack of actual resource to build this type of company. I think in these European countries, is by no means is an infrastructural problem, because the infrastructure is all there and people are just waiting for someone to use it. But then it's a psychological obstacle, because I think majority of people that get into entrepreneurship in the last 15 years, I speak for myself in this case, but maybe for others too, that you're influenced in some way, shape or form by an American entrepreneur. Because when I grew up, I was like Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg. To me, that was like, well, you say you can make that? How much money? How much money? And I was like, that's crazy. And so then you naturally kind of grow up like kind of glamorizing that mentality and that state of business state of mind. This is James Wisson. We spoke with many people about that sort of difference between the American and the English entrepreneur, and then correspondingly the investors as well. And then you get into the entrepreneurship scene. So I used to work in VC. I feel like I say that on every episode, right? Oh, I used to work in VC. but like when I was there, I was kind of like, I thought these guys are supposed to, kind of make huge bets and just things rocket off to the moon, right? Whereas this is like extremely methodical. And it was very methodical based on, are they making this much revenue? Okay, they're not, but hey, boss, the idea is great though. Look at this, look at this technology. It's amazing. Oh no, the pre-money valuation is like way too high. Yeah, exactly. And it's like, wait, I don't think you understand. This is unbelievable technology. Surely we should at least talk to them. Like, no, their pre-revenue and their pre-money valuation is like 5 million. No chance. And then I realized, okay, there's a huge difference. So I asked them, I said, well, what is the difference here? Like, why are they so different in America as opposed to here? Is that a cultural thing? And I know we've discussed the cultural elements of it, but we also discussed the market size and also where the money is actually coming from. Because in the UK, they have this new scheme in the last couple of years called EIS, the Entrepreneurship Investment Scheme. Right. So that is to channel money into early stage startups. Because now if you're a high net worth individual and you invest, let's say £1 million into startups and you lose it all, whatever your tax bracket is, you can claim that back on your investment. So it's to encourage you investing more into startups. And the thing with that is majority of the money going into the EIS scheme is coming from property. It's coming from old money. So these are not, and James, this is something you brought up once, because in America, a lot of the money is coming from a founder who's exited a previous business, made loads of money, and now wants to invest in another founder that reminds them of themselves so they can relive the journey vicariously, right?
Or at least the capital allocator, right? If you're not the money, you're at least allocating the capital, yeah.
Exactly. Whereas here, it's somebody who owns 20 properties, has a portfolio, and is like, maybe I could save a little bit more of my taxes if I do a couple of these. So it's a different mentality.
What's really interesting as well. What's really interesting is like Americans are going to start picking up on the UK habits, I'm sure, over the next couple of years. Because of what I've heard anecdotally through American investors is like, we created there was an environment in the last 2 years where there was all this free money. Everything was getting funded, every kind of wacky, crazy, zany, out there technology, right? Like we're talking specifically stuff like Web3, crypto over the last couple of years. Maybe we'll see a similar thing with like AI in the next couple of years in terms of that bubble effect. But we're now seeing the startups of any stage need to really be focused on your burn. Do you have a clear path to profitability, or are you profitable? And that very much comes back to the numbers. So it's like, okay, maybe the American mentality is, oh, this is a fantastic technology, let's throw money at it. But now in this bear market, people are going to have to adopt more of that UK mentality and be like, all right, what are the metrics? What are the numbers? Where are we headed? Riding more of a tight ship, which will be interesting to see play out over the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and deciding quickly based on those metrics. I think that's something where we have a bit to learn too. It might not necessarily be a yes, but it'll be an answer quickly. And that's really, it's refreshing when you talk to a VC who's much more in the American mindset, because they'll say no within half an hour if they have to say no. And so you can just move on to something else. If you're spending 7 hours talking to the people and they're going into the details of your technology and they're going into the details of your business plan and they're really picking it apart, it's disheartening. You kind of want them to you want them to actually tell you, this is interesting, I'd be willing to invest, and based on that, then we can discuss the actual details. And it's not as if they don't have a decision, they don't have an opinion that they can provide afterwards. We might be navigating, but we're not just taking decisions without their input. If they're able to give me an answer quickly and then invest and then help me build the company afterwards, then that's much more interesting. I think that's another cultural thing. Yeah,
it's intuition as well. I think it's definitely cultural. But it's also this stat that I learned from someone actually at the event that we met at, Chris, which was Frontier Deep Tech in London. Yeah, nice event, full of lovely people. I said it before, but what I loved about that event is, like, because it was very small, relatively small, I would say under like 100 people, everyone had something of value to add, right? There were no kind of people, there were no like industry types kind of milling around. It was like everyone was very much knew who they were there for, knew who they wanted to meet, knew what they wanted to talk about, and it was a really tight ship. I really enjoyed that event. But the point I was making is that something like 70% of VCs in the UK are ex-finance as opposed to founders. And I think a lot of what we're seeing and all the stuff we talked about in the last 10 minutes, frankly, can be explained away by that simple fact. Because I worked in banking. My mate Suraj has worked in finance. We know plenty of guys who worked in finance. And it's no secret that the world is very structured. You kind of do as you're told. It does not encourage and, frankly, actively stamps out creativity, right? Yeah. So you have a whole generation of investors that basically come in with their models and with all of these kind of parameters they're looking for. And instead of having that natural intuition that would probably come from an ex-founder or someone who's founded multiple companies, and being able, as you said, to jump on it and be like, all right, this is going to work straight off the bat. I'm going to put money in and we'll make it happen together. I'm going to place a bet on you, basically, you and your idea to make it work. It's much more like, how can I avoid risk at any cost by just kind of going through all the little numbers and all the lines and all the financial statements, which is what consumes all the time, right? So all this heavy DD without looking at the bigger picture, I think is something you see a lot more in Europe than in the US.
Yeah, it means you waste a lot of time raising when you could actually build the company. And it means also that you can game that. If you know how the VCs function and they're all just looking at the numbers, then you just need to say the right numbers and write the right BP. And it's much more satisfying to dig into how the business, how you're building the business and the decisions you made in your strategy. It's a lot more brainstorming than what are your numbers, does it fit in? And that's much more interesting. But I think it is cultural to not want to say no and to avoid making decisions. It's much more heartening when you get a no quickly because you can just move on to something else.
It's part of that same risk aversion, because by not saying no, you're not taking a risk by saying no, because no might be a risk as well. And that, well, I can't say yes later on if I've said no now. So if I don't say anything, I still have the opportunity to say yes later. But I think a metric that I would love to track over the next couple of years that to me would seriously indicate that there is a commercial mentality shift in the UK or in France is the percentage of graduates that go into employment by a startup straight out of university rather than go into employment by the financial industry. Because at the moment in London, I think it's something like, I think London's GDP is 70% financial services. So naturally, like me and James went to university together, and most of the people that we know, including ourselves, they all go to finance, man. And it's like we all studied STEM as well. We're all engineers by trade.
Yeah.
But when I first went into university, I remember a guy said to me, "Yeah, I said, what you want to do in the future?" He says, "I want to work in an investment bank." And I kind of looked at him like he had three heads, because I was like, they don't study finance in this university. Like, it's only a science. And he goes, yeah, but basically, they hire science people because you can problem solve. And I'd never heard that mentality before. I was like, what moron. like, why would anyone?
Bro, I feel shame, man. I feel shame you telling this story. I'm like, why did I ever did this way? How did I let myself be led down this path?
I feel more shame because I didn't initially. I was like, what an idiot. And then 4 years later, I was
converted.
Yeah, 4 years later, I was like, oh yeah, which hedge fund can I apply to?
No, but man, like, no one comes to a STEM uni being like, I'm going to be a banker in a suit, really.
No,
I mean, that guy did for real. Because I certainly didn't, and I'm like you. I had my mind changed, albeit quite soon after coming through the doors. Yeah. And you kind of just chase the money. But I think what's interesting about that point is, like, even in the last, when did we start uni? 2015. So even in the last 7 or so years, there's been a huge shift in where the money is, and it's like everyone's now seeing that the money's in tech. And I think even since we started, I remember people wanted to go work at Amazon and Apple and this and that. That's not even the case anymore. I mean, look at all the layoffs in big tech. Yeah. It's not even a case where, I want to go to a huge tech company. It's like, I want to work in that 20-person startup, or I'm going to go start my own thing. So even since we've graduated or been at uni, like, that mentality has shifted massively. And I think it's only just going to increase at that. But I do remember the first year that I joined in 2015 in engineering was the first year that the cohort switched from graduates, the majority working in engineering versus in finance. So before it was like 40-60. So I saw that pivot point where it became like 55-45 or whatever it was. And I think that increased. Exactly, yeah. Oh, wow. Where the actual engineering graduates going into finance outweighed them going into industry or engineering or some closely related space, it's tragic if you think about it. But I think that is slowly being reversed. But what you're saying is fewer people going into industry and more into computer science type roles, isn't it? Yeah.
True, but even I was speaking to a guy who's in first year, the same course, doing computer science in the same university we went to, and he said to me like, "Oh, that job you used to have is great." He's some asset manager I worked at, and I was like, well, it's more nuanced than that. It really depends on what you want in life, because you meet a certain kind of person in that stream of work, and you'll meet a certain kind of person, in software or technology, or even in the size of the organization. And he kind of goes, well, talk to me about the differences then. I kind of just said to him, like, it really comes down to what you want, because if you want to feel inspired day by day, I personally, this is my personal opinion, and I'm sure you guys probably agree, strongly doubt you will find that in a huge corporation. Like, the people there are not typically inspiring individuals on a personal level, and the work you're doing is not driving you to be like, hey, look, we're changing the world, when you're smashing buttons in Excel and PowerPoint. It's just typically not how it works. And he said, well, to be honest, and he then voiced the mentality, which I think is crazy. This is his third month of university. He said, well, to be honest, I just want to get a high paying job initially, make some money, buy a house, get my mortgage paid, and then I can go think of other things. And it's the classic story. I mean, I think that's what the majority of people go into that line of work.
Yeah, ironically, you might spend a few years building up that capital, and then you'll be too tired or tied into something to then actually do the job.
Exactly.
It's interesting. I think there's been in the past 60 years, maybe, there's been a growing disillusionment with the path that you could follow. Because it used to be that you'd be guaranteed, if you had a good education, that you'd get a job afterwards and you'd be taken care of, and you could buy a house and build your family. But now people are looking a lot more at meaning. Can I actually have the opportunity to build something? Computer science gives you the opportunity to build something directly. You've got a lot of startups. You're talking startups working on nuclear reactors and rockets and stuff like that. So then that's possible. So why wouldn't I work on it myself? Mm-hmm. It's much more interesting than sticking to the line. And unfortunately, I think maybe that's a difference between the EU or Europe in any case and the US is you're taught that intelligence is having good degrees. and you're taught that being smart is going to the best schools and having the right reputation. But I saw somebody in a video this morning say, I mean, we talked about Zuckerberg. He dropped out of Stanford, and all these entrepreneurs dropped out of the universities they were in. So they didn't follow the path. As soon as they saw something interesting, they actually dropped out. But if you go to the end, that means that you followed a path. And I think the irony of all these systems, and in France, we're very concentrated on competition, what they call the concours, where if you want to be a doctor, you go through X years of studies, and then you go through a concours, and there's 2,000 of you, and they're going to be taking the top 100. I don't know what the statistics are, but it's basically that. So it's not about being good at your job, it's about being the best. But it's also about being the best at fitting into that model. And so when they then ask you to innovate, well, your mind isn't formatted for that. So the best people to innovate are probably those who are smart enough to actually leave the course, to try and leave the mold. And that's why you get people leaving with good ideas to go to other countries where you can actually finance those ideas and people are good, receptive to them.
It's fascinating.
That's fascinating, and it's something that me and Suraj actually talk about offline, but we never really talk about on the pod, which is the future of education and what it looks like. Because I personally believe that a lot of what you're describing is very deep rooted, obviously, in our culture and our education system. And that's where change needs to happen in terms of, I mean, we've been through it ourselves. I'm sure all three of us have. It's like at school, you're told you want to get a good paying job, you want to provide for your family, you want to live comfortably.
Yeah.
And the way to do that is to be as risk averse as possible, which is all the steps you're describing, right? Which is pass your exams, tick all of these boxes, and you'll get a good job and you'll be happy and you'll be comfortable. And anything that even smells slightly risky, you're just told to run away from. And that's a very hard tightrope to walk, because like, yes, going back to Suraj's anecdote of his friend, it's like, yes, you do want that financial backing to, you know, support yourself in your early stages of your life, make sure you have a home, make sure you can be fed and all of this, provide for a family if you have a young family. But then where's the cutoff point? You know, where do you stop kind of living in your comfort zone and are able to branch out? And the reality is, by the time you're late 20s, 30s, you're too far down that road, and you say, oh, you're kind of, I think your youthful energy and zest for life kind of fades by that point, because you don't have that energy to go out and try and start your own thing. So it's about finding that balance, which is obviously far easier said than done.
Yeah, and if your financing landscape is based on institutional financing, where you have to fit the model because they're trying to duplicate what's already happened, because, you know, that's the model for success. And if the subsidies side of things, you have to tick the right boxes to be able to finance your project, then there's not much space for innovation. Which is why, I agree with the idea that the more we have business angels and ex-entrepreneurs and people like that with enough cash to invest in innovative ideas, the more we're able to actually bring new companies into the light, and not just companies based on what looks like the winning model.
And Chris, that's great insight, actually. But I wanted to touch on what you mentioned a few minutes ago, the nuclear fusion.
Yeah.
Right? Obviously, you saw the news, I think, was it early this week or late last week?
Yeah, in the US.
How do you feel about that? Yeah, how do you feel about that? Because obviously, you know, for any listeners, basically, we've managed to turn whatever it was, like 1 megajoule into 1.5 output, but you're kind of ignoring all of the factors of, you know, the massive energy loss that goes into the system. But essentially, when concentrated on a small, you know, number of, you know, atoms or nuclei, we can get more energy out than we put in. But this is only in the very confined laboratory conditions.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of people kind of getting ahead of themselves and being like, this is the end of oil, this is the end of solar, this is the end of everything. But what are your opinions in terms of, you know, maybe timelines of when this would be economically feasible? Whether you think this will in fact be, you know, nuclear fusion will be the forefront of the energy transition? Or I'd love to hear your take on that, because I know when we last spoke, we spoke at length about the future of energy.
Yeah. Well, I've lived this from the inside, because I used to be a researcher, and what you realize is that what ends up being in the media is quite far away from what you actually said. For a start, for most people, it's probably going to be very boring. You're going to go into the details, and that there's been a lot of other people working on the subject. And I think every year we see somebody talk about new innovations in batteries, and yet we're still running Duracell stuff. Nuclear fusion we've been working on for years and years and years. So I think it's natural for them to be bombastic and announce things which seem like they're just around the corner to keep people investing and keep people interested. I do believe in nuclear energy. I think it's an option that we set aside a bit too often. In France, we're something like 86% nuclear power, and if we hadn't had half of our nuclear power stations down for maintenance, then we'd have a better chance at getting over this energy crisis. But it's a combination, until you can have a base load based on renewable energy. Nuclear is a great option, and it's in any case much better than coal and gas and all those stuff. And as far as the technology is concerned, I think one thing that they never touch on, it's not necessarily about getting more energy out of the process, which is a crucial step. It's also how do you then change that into electricity that you can plug into the mains. Nobody's concentrating on that, I think, in the media, and I'm sure that that's one of the next big challenges.
Yeah, obviously I'm more of an energy enthusiast rather than someone who's like deep in the weeds with how the infrastructure works and everything. But is that, from your experience, is that typically how these new technologies come about? Is like, let's first prove out the concept and let's think about all the grisly infrastructure, boring admin stuff later. Is that the typical model, or should they actually be thinking about these two things in parallel?
Well, I think one of the main problems with stuff that comes out of the lab is that you're concentrating on building upon what was built before. And researchers like to research. They don't necessarily like to build companies. So there's a fair chance that there's been a lot of advancement in the technology. And so sometimes technology leaves the lab and it's far too advanced for any practical implementation. So you need to work on evangelizing, you need to work on industrializing, you need to build up the infrastructure to support that technology. And so it's a lot of marketing and it's a lot of projecting visions and stuff like that. I mean, we've been talking about self-driving cars for 30 years now. And Tesla looked like the best option recently, and they still haven't brought it out. But we're still very enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, on the subject of AVs, actually, there was a lot of. Did you see that kind of slew of negative press about a month and a half ago? Because you had like Argo AI shutting down in VW and Ford. They kind of internally shut that down.
Yeah.
I think you had one of the, I've got to say, Lewandowski came out and said, one of the pioneers of AVs came out and said, like, oh, these aren't going anywhere. A lot of it is kind of media hype, media kind of smoke and mirrors into making us believe that we've made a lot of progress, but actually it's stalling and this and that. And I think with AVs is a whole separate argument, but one that I find personally very interesting, which is that I think the goalposts are somewhat skewed in the terms of, I think we need to think from first principles. Like, what is the purpose of an autonomous vehicle? It should be to prevent lives, prevent injuries, prevent road deaths, right? That's really the advent of it. And I think it's almost kind of mutated into this amazing futuristic technology that people are chasing for the sake of it, kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, we must have 100% autonomy, and I want to have a glass of wine while I sit behind the windshield and not have it to, like, without a care in the world, and read a book and have a nap.
Yeah.
But it's like, if we can get the preventative technologies, for example, I'm an advocate of LiDAR. I think LiDAR is very, very promising. But if we're kind of striving towards this future in which all cars are self-driving and they have far, far lower accident rates than humans, I think you're looking at 50 to 100 years, frankly. But if we're talking about just improving the driver, but they still have to be behind the wheel and put inputs in every now and then, but the vast majority of the work is done by the computer, I think we can get that in the next 5 to 10 years. But that's not something that's being communicated well by the media or by companies, frankly.
I think it's we're very binary in that aspect. We either want fully automatic or we want to do it all ourselves. And we're kind of fighting against that. We think that AI is really important. Automatic stuff's really important. It allows us to go faster. It allows us to avoid stuff, but we need to be able to work with it. I think in this respect, science fiction is quite useful because it's useful to explore an idea, how things could go right, how things can go wrong. And my worst, as soon as I pitch something and I hear somebody say, I think there was an episode of Black Mirror on that, that's my nightmare, because they systematically push it towards the worst possible conclusion. But sometimes it's cool and you get good science fiction, and we've had tactile screens, holographic stuff. We've had mobile phones, the kind of technology we're using right now. All that's come from the imagination and people testing it out with films and brainstorming those ideas. And then that inspired people to actually develop the technology.
I think Black Mirror is just the human propensity to imagine the worst case scenario.
Yeah. That's why you need a human in the loop. I mean, you could have I remember, what's it called, War Games. And every year we have people saying, well, we should plug the nuke straight into AI because, they'd react quicker and then we have the best defense ever. But who's going to trust that kind of system? It's terrible. And you don't, there's no silver bullet in AI. You don't have a system which you can just switch on and it'll solve everything. It will make mistakes. Because I think in the end, AI is basically a bigger human brain and humans are good at making mistakes. The point is you need to learn from the mistakes and make sure that you don't fail immediately when you make that mistake.
Yeah. What's funny is we might be looking back, our descendants in 200 years, 300 years, maybe looking back and be like, how the fuck was a human ever allowed to make a single decision? Right?
Yeah.
How were they ever allowed to drive cars? How were they ever allowed to fly planes, given the fact that there are even, a relatively small number of crashes?
Oh, yeah. You have to think about it. You're driving, a ton of steel or whatever at 100 miles an hour down the road with 1,000 other people, relying on your instincts when looking at your attention span. It's very easy to miss something. We don't have the reflexes to be able to accurately manage all that.
So what are you bullish on in AI then? Because obviously, we have ChatGPT, we have all of these open AI models that have picked up a lot of pace recently, and everyone's kind of looking at the fairly low-hanging fruit of, copywriting, image generation, more creative aspects. Where do you think AI can actually be taken on a big scale in the next, decade or so? Because, a lot of people, including Sam Altman, have talked about AI being a genuine replacement for things like Google and search and all of that. Do you think that's realistic, or do you kind of have your sights set higher, or what's your opinion on that?
I mean, it depends on what you talk about when you're saying replace Google. I don't think that's necessarily the objective. You need to think, what does Google actually do for us? It's being able to access information. So what would AI necessarily replace with Google? Is it still querying, or it would be more interesting if the AI brought the information to you without you wanting it at the right moment? Now that would be cool if you had systems which are able to help you with the chores or anticipate what you need and help you do your job better. I see AI much more as an expander of what we're capable of doing than a replacement of people. And I see AI really, we call it the co-pilot aspect of things. We don't see it as necessarily replacing people. We see it as enabling people to do more than they could before. And that's what technology is supposed to do. And I think AI is supposed to do that too. But it should be companionship. It should be the ability to work with machines rather than be afraid of being replaced by machines. Mm-hmm. I think if you replace people with computers, at one point the computers are just going to have people problems.
In this context, I think it's the fact that, have you seen ChatGPT?
Yeah.
Used it? Yeah. So that is probably bringing down the overall number of Google searches. So not replace Google as, we don't need Google anymore, but in the sense of more curated, localized information delivery. So if, for example, if I need to write a piece of software, I'm kind of stuck. Okay, how do I write this SQL query? Yes, I could use Google, go on Stack Overflow, sift through maybe 3 or 4 pages, find the answer I need, learn some other arguably unnecessary things along the way, but overall, kind of get a more comprehensive picture. This 30, 40 years ago, I would have probably picked up a book on SQL and had to go to a chapter and probably pulled my hair out in the process. But this thing is just delivering that information like through natural language. Hey, please give me this. There you go.
Yeah. And it could be wrong. You get false positives.
Could be wrong. Yeah, it could be wrong.
I used GitHub Copilot during the testing phase, and sometimes it's a bit frustrating. You think, oh, I'm going to get replaced by this algorithm. But there's 2 important factors there. Did you actually want to do the job in the first place? It's much more satisfying if it just brings you the result immediately and you're able to say, well, no, not exactly that, but that points me in the right direction. Or from time to time, that's exactly what I wanted. And if you're getting the gain from that, then why are we actually complaining? It's it'd be difficult the day when these AIs start saying, well, I want my fair share of the work and I seem to be doing most of it, so I'll take most of the value from that. But until then, it's speeding us up. It's letting us do less of the mundane stuff and concentrate on the interesting stuff.
I'd say what's more likely to happen quicker is your boss saying, hey, this thing is doing more of the work, so I'm going to pay you less. So the AI ain't getting shit, but your boss going to be taking a bigger cut.
Well, that's a bad boss. I mean, if it's like outsourcing. So if you have somebody who's spending 80% of their time on something which is mundane, and all of a sudden they can spend all of their time on the 20% where they're really producing something interesting, then that's great.
Yeah. It ties into the bigger question of what are people going to do as more and more jobs get replaced, and the technology starts to really become automated to the level that we just don't need people to work as much.
Yeah. Well, in the long term, it's just people will be focusing on creativity and what they're interested in. In the short term, the complicated side of things is that AI can learn faster than people. And if you know how to do a job and all of a sudden that job is done by something else, then it's going to be difficult for you to learn the next step.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The jobs are going to evolve. I think to your previous point, it's like, I don't see many jobs where they're going to be completely eradicated. It's almost like how you said the AI is learning faster than the human. It's almost like on us as humans now, how quickly can we adapt to the AI? So it's like, how quickly can we understand where the AI can pick up all of these mundane tasks or the areas of our job where we're perhaps not needed as much, and how can we focus, as you said, on the 20% of stuff that matters, and the speed at which we can kind of pivot and change our skill set to that. And I'm thinking predominantly in terms of kind of shifting up the value chain. If you're like you're like a low-level programmer, a junior programmer, and you're just putting in like bits of code, as SJ said, like going on GitHub and just looking up solutions, this and that. Obviously, you have no value there anymore, and you shouldn't be paid for that kind of stuff. So maybe you move up the stack and you start looking at the architecture from a more holistic point of view. Or if you're a designer, that could mean, instead of you actually drawing out, sketching the designs, you have a much more kind of higher level view of, whatever you're designing, be that, a physical object or a video or anything like that. And it's about that kind of pivoting and understanding how your role is going to change and how quickly you can adapt to that.
Yeah, I think the main question we're talking about this, there's quite a few jobs have been replaced in the past. You had manual data entry and people preparing spreadsheets and people preparing data, and now you can just go through Google Analytics or software like that and it automatically produces the data, and maybe tomorrow you'll have a system which automatically picks out the parts which are interesting and then provides the context to the person for them to be able to decide. But the real risk is all these systems capitalizing value, and you end up with a disproportionate amount of people who control the data and the AI having all that value, and people being disenfranchised rather than actually participating and gaining in functionality and interest.
Yeah, because I think for me, when I look at it, the biggest fear is that it turns into a situation where it's like, hey, well, we can get AI to do all this work. Now we don't need to hire humans to do it. So you guys are all just unemployed now. That would be the disaster, right? So much specialization occurs that, large hordes of the population are literally left jobless in a system that sees no reason or responsibility to cater for them as human beings and what they can still offer. Because what they can offer now is, as you guys were talking about, is vast amounts of creativity and looking at places where this new technology can be applied to go even further. But the fear is that they just get left there on a welfare check, and then that in the short term to me is like, oh, that could be bad. And I only see that really changing until it gets so bad that it's like, hey, this is not a solution. This is not a solution.
That's your dystopia. Yeah. That's what you want to avoid. Because there's no real gain in it. I mean, you can use technologies for good or for bad. I work in cybersecurity. You're forever asking yourself, if you develop systems which allow people to understand data better, you can use them to anticipate attacks, or you can use them to attack. That's always a problem, and it depends on where the value is and who's controlling the technology.
Great point there, Chris. Speaking of that, we haven't even asked you what you do at your company. We've had such a great conversation.
and we're towards the end of it too.
Yeah, we were seeing how long we could, rig it out and then not have to ask you. But I'm joking. But how is Malizen? Like, what do you guys do? Can you give us like the elevator pitch on, what you do, what problem you solve, who you serve?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in cybersecurity, the focus is often on the technology side of things. We're often focused on detection system and response systems, and because the general population has kind of grown up with antiviral software and firewalls and stuff like that, we don't necessarily know that there's a lot of people actually working in the job. We were talking about automating things earlier on. There's a lot of automation in cybersecurity, but necessarily now that everything's connected and that attacking stuff has value and there's a lot of work in that, you can't just rely on automatic systems. And we saw that a couple of years ago. So our focus is on helping teams to be able to deal with the amounts of information that you have to look through to see attacks and work better with automatic detection systems. And so we used to be researchers focusing on data visualization for understanding and sifting through information. We're really inspired by science fiction too, all these interfaces where you represent a lot of data and you're able to understand it quickly, and you're not just sifting through text and lines of codes and Excel spreadsheets or terrible stuff like that. But we know that AI can bring a lot to that, but it can only do the majority of the work. Where humans are interesting and humans are useful in that aspect is being able to understand new attacks and being able to guide the AI in the right direction. So we really are talking about a partnership between AI and people. And today our focus is helping teams faced with too many attacks to be able to manage all those different attacks, to work with automatic systems and to help them represent more than they are. So if you've got a small cyber team, we want them to be virtually twice as big. If you're a big company and you can't find enough people, and we want them to be able to multiply their teams, but also recruit people easier. And basically, when it used to be, I think today we're currently looking at AI and then maybe someone intervenes. So the AI will do a lot of the detection phase. And our point of view is that, no, let's make it easier for people to make decisions. And then we'll learn from those decisions and we'll try and help them out rather than trying to replace them.
Mm-hmm. What's the biggest focuses now for you guys in the next year?
Well, our platform needs to connect with a lot of different data sources. So we're focusing a lot on connectors. We've got visualization. That step's quite well done now. But now we're communicating more and more about the co-pilot aspect of things. So the machine learning, which is the second step of things. How can we learn from what decisions are being made? How can we bring the right context at the right moment? How can we be the best possible co-pilot to help people orchestrate, detect, understand, and respond to cybersecurity incidents? Mm-hmm. And so we're going to be looking to work with a lot more companies than today. We've worked a lot with defense. We've worked a lot with big companies in France. And we're also looking at exploring the UK market, Scandinavian market, companies in those countries. We briefly were in Montreal the other day just to explore that, to see, to feel the market, see how interesting that was, and it looks like there's quite a lot of business to do there. And we're going to be doubling the team, and we're raising funds to actually get to that objective.
Nice. I imagine this process of creating the best possible Copilot is intertwined with your users. Really understand.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. We want to feel like they're working with somebody. If you're talking about the Turing test and stuff like that. We want it to be a real partnership. So if you're working with GitHub Copilot or tools like that, we want people to feel like they're not being replaced. That they have this assistant which is doing a lot of the heavy work for them and bringing them the answers, so that they don't have to go and get them, and they can then decide and work better with the other people.
Fantastic.
So I had one more question. I remember when we met, you recommended a book to me called Sapiens.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I know you kind of waxed lyrical about it, and I bought the book, but I haven't yet started it. I actually know I read the blurb about it. It's kind of just charting the history of humankind, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Do you have can you give listeners a kind of, very short 1 minute summary of it, or what your key learnings from that book were, or why you found it so fascinating?
Well, I found it interesting because it goes from the beginning, and it asks the question, why are there 7 billion people on Earth? Why is our species so populous compared to other species? And how we were able to scale up our civilizations, what mechanisms were invented and what things were discovered, and what's our internal mechanism which allows us to function as a species of 7 billion. I mean, we have lots of problems, but they haven't stopped us from growing so big and doing so much. But we did start off living in caves. So how were we able to leave the caves? And it goes step through step. So it goes through how we are able to live to groups of 250 people, through gossip and mechanisms like that, how agriculture really changed our aspect and made us think about the future and plan things out, how fictions allowed us to align ourselves with other groups of people. So if you feel aligned with 60 million other people, you're going to have a story. If you're going to support, we were talking about, we've been through the World Cup recently. How can you possibly be aligned with 60 other million people for one single cause? Well, you have to have a story behind that. And then they talk about religions being a strong fiction, which will probably annoy people, and money being another fiction, and lots of aspects like that. Now, I haven't finished the book, but it really is interesting, and it gives you a lot of ideas about how to communicate and understand people better, and see what mechanisms you can actually use, and understand a bit better about how we're evolving and how we're developing.
Yeah, we didn't have the chance to say condolences for the World Cup as well.
Yeah, well, there was that point where it was England versus France, and people are asking me, what side are you on? And I said, well, in any case, I'm on the winning side. So
I love that. Well, Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, man. Great to catch up. We did talk about having an in-person podcast, and maybe almost certainly we should do that in 2023, sometime in summer, when you're down in London, let's do it. We can set up like a nice, multi-camera setup, 4K, all of that.
Wow.
That'd be great.
That'd be great. With pleasure.
Awesome.
Nice one, man.
All the best for everything. It was an absolute pleasure speaking and meeting you.
Yeah, likewise.
Take care of yourself, man.
Take care.
Cheers. It's all right.